The first thing Kabir ever said to me was a lie. "I'm fine," he told me, standing in the rain outside my apartment building at 11 at night, his knuckles white around a duffel bag, blood dried at the corner of his lip. "I just need somewhere to crash." One night. That was 4 years ago. He never left. I didn't know it then, standing in my doorway in an old t-shirt with my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain, but that soaked, bruised, stubborn stranger was about to become the only person who ever made me understand what my own heart was for. I didn't know that loving him would take 4 years, would nearly break both of us, and would end, if it ends at all, with a truth neither of us was ready to say out loud. My name is Vahan. This is the story of how my best friend became the person I couldn't imagine my life without, and how nearly losing him was the only way I ever found the courage to keep him. Before Kabir, my life had a shape to it, small, quiet, predictable, the way I liked it. I was 20 years old, 3 years into a design degree I wasn't sure I wanted, living alone in a one-bedroom flat above a tailor's shop because my parents thought independence would be good for me. Mostly it meant I ate cereal for dinner and talked to no one for days at a stretch. Then, on a Tuesday night in October, someone pounded on my door like the building was on fire. I opened it expecting a delivery, or my neighbor locked out again. Instead, there was a boy I'd never seen before, tall, dark-haired, drenched to the bone, one eye starting to swell, a split lip, and eyes that looked like they were daring me to ask what happened so he could refuse to answer. "Wrong door," I said, which was a stupid thing to say, because obviously it wasn't a door he'd wandered into by accident. He was looking at the number on my apartment like he'd memorized it from somewhere. "Is this Samir's place?" he asked. His voice was rough, like he'd been crying and was furious about it. "Samir moved out in July. I've lived here since August." Something in his face cracked, just for a second. That particular kind of exhaustion that isn't about being tired, it's about running out of doors to knock on. He looked down at the duffel bag in his hand like it had betrayed him, and he laughed, short and humorless. "Of course," he muttered. "Of course he did." He turned to go. I don't know what made me say it. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the blood on his lip. Maybe it was some instinct I didn't have a name for yet. But I heard myself say, "You can sleep on my couch. Just for tonight." He turned back slowly, like he thought I was joking, or like he was deciding whether to trust me enough to laugh. "You don't know me." "No," I agreed. "But it's raining, and you're bleeding, and I have a couch nobody's using." He studied me for a long moment. Long enough that I felt strangely seen, like he was reading something in me I hadn't decided to show yet. And then he stepped inside without another word, dripping onto my hallway floor, and my quiet, predictable life quietly ended. His name was Kabir. He was 19, a year younger than me, and he'd been thrown out of his cousin's flat that night after a fight I wouldn't understand the full shape of for another year. He didn't explain the bruise. I didn't ask twice. I gave him a towel, a dry shirt 3 sizes too big for him, and the couch, and I lay awake in my own bed listening to a stranger breathe in my living room, feeling, absurdly, less alone than I had in months. He was gone by the time I woke up. I remember the disappointment hit harder than it should have for someone I'd known for 12 hours. But he'd left the borrowed shirt folded on the couch, and underneath it, on a torn scrap of paper, for words in blocky, careful handwriting. "Thank you. I'll return this." He came back 3 days later to return the shirt. He stayed for coffee. The coffee turned into 6 hours of conversation on my floor, our backs against the couch. And somewhere in those 6 hours we discovered that we could talk to each other the way you talk to someone you've known your whole life, not someone you met in a doorway during a thunderstorm. By the end of that month, he'd all but moved in. First it was 1 night a week when things at his cousin's got bad, then 3 nights. Then he just never really left, and neither of us ever formally discussed it. It simply became true, the way the sun becomes part of the morning. Kabir lived with me now. My apartment had 2 toothbrushes in the cup by the sink, and I couldn't remember, after a while, what silence had sounded like before him. I told myself it was friendship. For a long time, that was even true. There's a particular kind of intimacy that grows between 2 people who share small spaces and long silences, and neither of us noticed how deep it had gotten until it was already too late to call it ordinary. It was in the little things first. The way Kabir learned exactly how I took my tea, too much sugar, a little milk, never let it steep too long, without ever asking, just from watching me make it a dozen times. The way I learned that he couldn't sleep without some kind of noise, so I started leaving a fan running even in winter, and he never mentioned it. And I never mentioned that I knew why he needed it. We fell into rhythms. He'd cook badly and confidently. I'd eat it anyway and tell him it was good, and he'd know I was lying and grin like it was the highest compliment I could pay him. Some nights we'd sit on the narrow balcony with our shoulders pressed together against the cold, passing one cigarette between us even though neither of us really smoked, just because it gave our hands something to do that wasn't touching each other, though God knows we both wanted to. I remember the exact night I understood something had shifted. It was February, nearly 4 months after he'd first shown up at my door, and we were watching some forgettable film on my laptop, squeezed onto a couch that was really only built for one person. Kabir had fallen half asleep, his head slipping sideways until it landed, without either of us deciding it should, on my shoulder. I didn't move. I sat there with my heart going so loud I was sure he could hear it even in his sleep, memorizing the weight of him, the smell of his shampoo, the way his breath went slow and even against my collarbone. And I thought, with a kind of quiet terror, I don't want this to be just a couch. I don't want this to be just friendship. I didn't say anything. I didn't even let myself think the word that belonged to what I was feeling. Not yet. I just sat very still until the film ended and the credits lit the room blue, and I gently, carefully, shifted so he'd wake up thinking he'd simply dozed off, and neither of us mentioned it the next morning, though I caught him touching his own shoulder once, absently, like he was trying to remember something. That was the beginning of the part of the story where we both started lying to each other by omission. Not cruel lies, just the kind two people tell when they're each terrified of being the one who says it first and finding out the other doesn't feel the same. Spring came, and with it, 100 almost moments that neither of us acknowledged out loud. There was the night we got caught in a downpour walking back from the market and ran laughing under an awning, both of us soaked, and stood there catching our breath inches apart, his eyes dropping to my mouth for half a second before he looked away fast and said something about buying an umbrella tomorrow. There was the afternoon he taught me to ride a motorbike in the empty lot behind our building, his hands over mine on the handlebars, his chest against my back, and neither of us moved away when the lesson was clearly over. There was jealousy, too, though it took me longer to recognize it in myself. Kabir had always been the kind of person people were drawn to, easy laugh, easy warmth. And when a classmate of his named Rehan started showing up more, texting him constantly, finding excuses to stop by our apartment, something ugly and unfamiliar twisted in my chest every single time. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lot of things that spring. "You've gone quiet," Kabir said one evening, after Rehan had left, dropping onto the couch beside me with 2 cups of chai. "You get like that when he's around." "I don't know what you mean," I said, staring very hard at the television. He was quiet for a moment, studying me in that way he had, like he could see straight through the walls I was building. "Okay," he said softly, and let it go, but something in his voice told me he hadn't really believed me, and something in mine told him I knew it. That was the year I learned that love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, over months, in shared cups of tea and half-asleep heads on shoulders, and you don't realize how deep it's rooted until the thought of losing it feels like losing a limb. It happened on his birthday. I'd planned something small, string lights on the balcony, a cake I'd definitely butchered the frosting on, a bottle of cheap wine we couldn't really afford. Just the two of us, because Kabir had quietly admitted once that birthdays had never meant much to him growing up, and I'd promised myself, without saying so, that this one would be different. He came home to find the lights strung crookedly across the balcony and stopped dead in the doorway, and for a second I thought I'd overdone it, made it too much, given away too much of what I felt in the careful arrangement of fairy lights and one lopsided cake. But when he turned to look at me, his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the lights. "You did this?" he asked, like it was the strangest, most improbable thing anyone had ever done for him. "It's your birthday," I said, like that explained everything, though we both understood it explained nothing at all about why my hands were shaking as I lit the single candle. We sat out on the balcony afterward, plates empty, wine mostly gone, the city humming distantly below us, and the silence between us had a texture to it that night. Charged, waiting, the kind of silence that exists right before someone says something that changes everything. Nobody's ever done something like this for me. Kabir said quietly, looking not at me, but at the string lights, his voice unsteady in a way I'd never heard from him. Not once. Not my whole life. That's not true anymore, I said. Not since October. He looked at me then. Really looked. The way he had that first night in the rain. Like he was trying to read something written just beneath my skin. And the space between us on that narrow balcony seemed to shrink without either of us moving. I could count his eyelashes. I could see the small scar above his eyebrow I'd never asked about. I could feel his breath, warm against the cold night air, inches from my own. Vahan, he said, so quietly it was almost lost to the wind. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone? My heart was a drum in my throat. Anything. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked away, out at the city, jaw tight, and I watched for years. No, for months, though it already felt like a lifetime, of careful, unspoken feeling gather behind his eyes and refused to come out. Never mind, he said finally, and the moment folded closed like a door swinging shut, and something in my chest ached with a grief I didn't have a name for, because we had come so close, so unbearably close, to the truth, and both of us had flinched. We went to bed that night without saying it. I lay awake for hours listening to him toss and turn on the other side of the wall, both of us awake, both of us aching, neither of us brave enough to walk the 6 feet between our doors. I didn't know then that the cost of that silence would nearly cost me him completely. I didn't know that somewhere out there, a boy named Rayhan was about to ask Kabir something that would force the truth out of both of us. Not gently, the way I'd always imagined it, but in fire, in heartbreak, in the kind of collision you don't see coming until you're already in it. I told myself the moment on the balcony would fade if I just gave it enough time. That's the lie people tell themselves right before everything falls apart. For 2 weeks after Kabir's birthday, something in the apartment felt different, careful, like we were both walking around a crack in the floor neither of us wanted to look at directly. We still talked. We still shared tea, still argued over which film to watch, still sat shoulder to shoulder on that too small couch. But there was a new distance folded into the closeness, a held breath neither of us let out. And then Rayhan started coming around more. I want to be honest about something. I never disliked Rayhan. That would have been simpler. He was warm, funny in the easy way Kabir was, the kind of person who remembered your coffee order after meeting you once. It would have been so much easier to hate him. Instead, I just watched him laugh with Kabir on our couch, in our kitchen, in the space I'd quietly started thinking of as ours, and felt something small and ugly curl tighter in my chest every time. He likes you, I said one night, after Rayhan had left, the words coming out sharper than I meant them to. I was washing dishes I didn't need to wash, just to have somewhere to put my hands. Kabir looked up from his phone, surprised. Rayhan, we're just friends. He looks at you the way. I stopped myself, throat suddenly tight, because I'd nearly said the way I look at you, and the dish I was holding slipped from my hands and cracked against the sink. Kabir was beside me in a second, careful hands checking mine for cuts, his voice gentle in a way that made everything worse. Hey, look at me. You okay? I'm fine, I said, echoing, without meaning to, the very first lie he'd ever told me, standing in that doorway in the rain. He caught it too. I saw it land in his eyes, saw him almost smile at the strange symmetry of it, and for one unbearable second I thought he might finally say the thing neither of us had said. Instead he just held my hand a beat longer than necessary, thumb brushing careful circles over my knuckles, and said, quietly, you know you can tell me anything, right? I know, I lied again, and pulled my hand back before I did something we couldn't take back over broken dishware and unwashed teacups. I didn't know, that night, that I'd already run out of time to tell him the truth on my own terms. Life doesn't wait for you to be brave. Sometimes it just shoves the truth into the room and dares you to survive it. It was a Thursday. I remember because I'd come home early from a class that got canceled. Keys already in my hand before I registered that Kabir wasn't alone. Rayhan's voice drifted from the kitchen, low, urgent, and I stopped in the hallway without deciding to. The way you stop when your body understands something your mind isn't ready for yet. And I think you should just tell him, Rayhan was saying. Whatever's going on with you and Vihan, it's obvious to everyone except apparently the two of you. My whole body went still. It's not that simple, Kabir said, and his voice had a rawness in it I'd never heard directed at anyone but me. What if I'm wrong about what he feels? What if I say something and it changes everything, and not in the way I want? Kabir. Rayhan's voice softened. I've watched you talk about him for months. The way your whole face changes when you say his name. If that's not obvious to you, it's because you're too scared to look at it straight on. There was a long silence. I stood frozen in my own hallway, heart slamming so hard I was sure they'd hear it through the wall. Every nerve in my body caught between the desperate hope of what I'd just heard and the terror of what came next. I love him, Kabir said finally, so quiet I almost missed it, like the words cost him something to say, even in an empty kitchen with only one witness who wasn't supposed to be listening. I've loved him since the second month, maybe before that. Since the couch. Since he let a stranger sleep in his apartment because it was raining and didn't ask for anything back. I don't remember deciding to step backward. I don't remember my hand finding the front door, or the door closing too loud behind me, or my feet carrying me down the stairwell into the evening air, lungs working too hard for someone who hadn't run anywhere. I just remember standing on the street outside my own building, staring up at my own lit window, feeling like the entire architecture of my life had just been rearranged in 4 sentences I wasn't supposed to hear. He loved me. He'd loved me for almost as long as I'd loved him. And somehow that truth, the very thing I'd wanted for months, had arrived sideways, stolen, through a wall, and now I had no idea how to walk back into that apartment and pretend I didn't know. I did what scared people do. I made it worse. Instead of going back up, I walked. For an hour, maybe 2, turning the words over and over. I love him, since the couch, since he let a stranger sleep, until they'd worn smooth and unreal in my mind, until some small, cruel voice in me started asking a different question. If he loves you, why has he never once tried? By the time I let myself back into the apartment, something in me had curdled the joy into something closer to fear, and fear, I'd learned, makes people say exactly the wrong thing. Kabir was on the couch, phone in his hand, and when he looked up at me his face did something complicated. Relief, then worry, then a carefulness that told me he could see something was wrong before I'd said a word. Where'd you go? You didn't answer your phone. Needed air, I said, which was true and also nothing at all like the truth. I stood in the doorway rather than sitting, some instinct telling me I needed the distance. Rayhan know his way to the kitchen pretty well these days. Kabir's brow furrowed. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. I heard myself getting sharper, meaner, some defensive animal part of me lashing out at the nearest target instead of naming the actual wound. Just seems like he's around a lot. For someone who's just a friend. Vahan, what is this about? I don't know. Kabir, why don't you tell me? Since you two seem to talk about everything. The words were out before I could stop them, ugly with a jealousy I'd never let myself say out loud before, and I watched them land on Kabir's face like a slap. Are you seriously accusing me of something with Rayhan right now? His voice had gone very quiet, very still, the voice of someone trying very hard not to break something. After everything. After everything what, Kabir? We've been dancing around whatever this is for 6 months, and you've never once said it to me. My voice cracked on the last word, all the fear and hope and stolen truth from that hallway spilling out sideways, aimed at the wrong target. So forgive me if I don't know what to think when I come home and hear you two whispering in my kitchen. Something shut down behind Kabir's eyes, a door closing, the exact opposite of the one that had almost opened between us on the balcony. You have no idea what you just heard, he said, standing, voice shaking now with something that wasn't anger, though I was too raw to see it clearly in the moment. And you don't get to twist it into something ugly just because you're scared. I'm not scared. You're terrified, he said, and it landed because it was true. You've been terrified since October. You let me move in without ever saying why. You watch me like you want to say something, and then you swallow it every single time. So don't stand there and act like I'm the one who can't be honest. The silence after that was the worst one we'd ever shared. Worse than the balcony. Worse than any of the almost moments. Because this one was full of things said wrong instead of things left unsaid. I watched him grab his jacket. I watched him move toward the door. Where are you going? My voice had lost all its earlier sharpness, gone thin and scared instead. I don't know, Kabir said, hand on the door, not looking back at me. Somewhere I don't have to watch you decide I'm not worth the risk. The door closed. Not slammed. Closed, carefully, quietly, which somehow hurt more, and I stood alone in the apartment that had felt like ours for 6 months and understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late, that I had just done to him the exact thing I'd been most afraid of him doing to me. He didn't come home. I texted. No reply. I called twice, and both times it rang out into a silence that felt like punishment I'd earned. I sat on the balcony where the string lights from his birthday still hung, unlit now, and replayed every version of the fight where I said something different, something true, something that wasn't armored in jealousy and fear. Rayhan called around midnight. I almost didn't answer. He's with me, Rayhan said. Before I could even say hello, his voice careful, not unkind. He's okay. Just needed somewhere to sit for a while. I said some things I shouldn't have. Yeah, Rayhan said, and there was no cruelty in it, just tired honesty. You should probably know what you heard in that kitchen, if you heard what I think you heard. It wasn't nothing, Vahan. He's loved you for a long time. I've been telling him for months to just say it. And tonight you basically confirmed his worst fear about what happens if he does. I sat with that for a long moment, throat tight. Can you tell him? I started, and then stopped, because whatever I needed to say couldn't be handed off through someone else. Never mind. Can you just tell me where you are? There was a pause, and then the address, and I was out the door before he'd even finished giving it, running down the same stairwell I'd fled through hours earlier, chasing something I finally understood I couldn't afford to lose. The walk to Rayhan's building took 11 minutes. I know because I counted every single one of them, rehearsing and discarding 100 different openings, none of which felt big enough for what I actually needed to say. Kabir was sitting on the front steps when I got there, jacket still on, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and something crossed his face. Not relief. Not yet. Something more guarded than that, like a door left open only a crack. Vahan, I heard you, I said, before he could say anything else, before my nerve could fail me the way it had for 6 straight months. In the kitchen, with Rayhan. I heard what you said. Kabir went very still. You said you loved me. I continued, voice shaking now, no armor left, nothing left to hide behind. Since the 2nd month. Since the couch. And I panicked, because I felt the exact same thing since almost the same night, and I didn't know what to do with hearing it secondhand instead of from you. So I did the worst possible thing, and I made it ugly instead of just saying it back. The night went very quiet around us. No traffic, no wind, just the two of us on a stranger's front steps with 4 years of unsaid things finally spilling into the open air. Say it now, Kabir said, voice barely above a whisper, standing slowly, closing the distance between us step by careful step. Please, say it now, where I can hear it. I closed the last of the distance myself. I love you, I said. I think I've loved you since you handed me back that shirt with a note that said I'll return this, and then you never really left, and I never wanted you to. For a moment neither of us moved, for years and 11 minutes, and one terrible fight collapsing into the space between our faces, and then Kabir's hand came up to my jaw, gentle, certain, the way it hadn't been on any of the almost moments before, and this time, finally, neither of us pulled away. What happened next is between the two of us, and the quiet dark of that stairwell, and I won't put it into words here. Some things are meant to stay just ours. But I can tell you that when we finally walked home together that night, hands linked, city humming soft around us, it didn't feel like the end of 6 months of fear. It felt like the very beginning of everything. We weren't perfect after that. Healing a friendship you almost broke takes longer than one confession on a stranger's front steps. And there's more to tell about the weeks that followed, about Kabir's cousin, about the night I finally understood why he showed up bleeding at my door that 1st October, and about the choice we had to make, together, about what our future would actually look like once the whole world knew what we were to each other. The weeks after that night on Rayhan's front steps didn't feel like the movies make you expect. There was no music swelling, no sudden ease. There was just 2 people who had spent 6 months hiding from each other, slowly learning how to stop. We were clumsy about it, at first. Kabir would catch himself pulling back from reaching for my hand in public, old habit stronger than new permission. I'd catch myself waiting for him to leave a room before I smiled too wide, forgetting I didn't have to hide it anymore. Love, it turns out, doesn't erase 4 years of caution overnight. But every day it got a little easier to just exist together out loud. It was almost 3 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday with rain against the windows, that Kabir finally told me the story he'd never told anyone. The story that had started all of this, standing bruised and soaked in my doorway that October night. "You never asked," Kabir said, staring at his hands, the two of us tangled together on the couch that had started this whole story. "About that first night. About the bruise. I figured you'd tell me when you wanted to," I said. "You don't have to now if it's too much." "I want to." He was quiet for a moment, gathering something that had clearly cost him a long time to be ready to hand over. "The cousin I was staying with, Samir, he wasn't just letting me crash there out of family duty. He knew about me, had known for a year, and he'd been fine with it, or I thought he had, until that night, when he found messages on my phone. From a guy I'd liked at school. I said nothing, just held on tighter, letting him find the words at his own pace. He didn't hit me because he lost his temper," Kabir continued, voice steady in the careful way people get when they've rehearsed telling a hard truth so it doesn't break them on the way out. "He hit me because he wanted me to understand exactly how unwelcome I'd become. Told me to get out before our parents found out, and it became their problem too. So I grabbed a bag and I ran. And the only address I had in my head from years back was an old friend's, Samir, funnily enough, different Samir, except he'd moved, and I ended up at your door instead by pure accident." "That wasn't an accident," I said quietly. "I don't believe that was an accident." Kabir looked up at me, something soft breaking open behind his eyes. "Neither do I. Not anymore." He told me the rest slowly. How he'd spent that whole first month terrified I'd figure out what he was and ask him to leave too. How every kindness I offered without asking questions had felt like evidence he was allowed to hope for the first time in his life, that being exactly who he was wouldn't cost him the people he loved. How falling for me had felt less like falling and more like finally landing somewhere solid, after a lifetime of bracing for impact. "I used to lie awake on that couch," he admitted, terrified that one day you'd wake up and realize you'd let a stranger take over your whole life and ask me to go. And every single day you didn't. I fell a little further, until there wasn't any version of my life left that didn't have you in the middle of it. I didn't have a clever thing to say to that. I just pulled him close and held him the way I wished someone had held him that night in the rain, for years too late, but no less real for the delay, and we stayed like that until the storm outside wore itself out. There's a particular kind of fear that comes after the person you love finally knows how you feel, the fear of everyone else finding out too. We didn't rush it. We told Rehan first, though he already knew, and he just grinned and said it was about time, and demanded to be the best man whenever we eventually got around to a wedding, which made Kabir go the color of a tomato in a way I intend to remind him of for the rest of our lives. Telling my parents took longer, and I won't pretend it was easy. There was a hard conversation, a silence that lasted 2 uncomfortable weeks, and then, slowly, my mother asking to meet this Kabir over dinner, and my father shaking his hand a little too firmly, the particular awkward formality of a parent trying very hard to get something right. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was an opening one, and Kabir squeezed my hand under the table the whole meal like he still couldn't quite believe he was allowed to be there. Kabir's own family remained a harder, longer road. Some doors stayed closed, at least for now, and there were nights that grief still found him unexpectedly, missing people who weren't ready to want him back. On those nights I didn't try to fix it. I just stayed, the way he'd once stayed for me without asking for anything in return, because I'd learned by then that love isn't about solving every wound. Sometimes it's just about refusing to let someone carry it alone. I'm writing the end of this from the same apartment above the tailor's shop, though we've since covered the walls with photographs neither of us had the courage to hang up in those first careful years. The two of us on that same narrow balcony, string lights still crooked, still ours. Kabir is asleep against my shoulder right now, the exact same way he was that night in February so long ago, except now I don't have to pretend I don't want it. He still can't sleep without noise. I still make his tea exactly the way he likes it, though these days he makes mine too. Rehan still shows up uninvited and insists it's tradition. And some nights, when it's quiet and the city hums soft below the balcony, I think about a soaked, bleeding boy standing in my doorway, for words scrawled on a torn scrap of paper. "Thank you. I'll return this." And I think about how he never really did return it, because somewhere along the way, without either of us deciding it on purpose, he simply became part of what this home was for. He walked into my life on a rainy October night looking for someone else's door. He never left, because it turned out he'd found the right one all along. If this story made you believe in slow burn love again, that's exactly why we told it.